Hello again and welcome to the channel. Today we'll be focusing on the 7 growing mistakes I often see people make in the beginning with roses. And as you can see, I've put up the first picture up here on the screen. And the first picture is to do with cutting back roses. And the mistake I often see new beginners do is they don't cut their roses back to an outward facing bud. Instead, they often tend to just clip at randomly. And the problem with clipping to an inward facing bud, for example, is that the rose shoots in on itself. So the branches grow together, they get tangled, they damage each other. You don't get air circulation in the bush, so you're more prone to get something like powdery mildew and a lot of diseases. Another problem is also purely aesthetic. You don't get a nice round shrub when you cut things inwards. You get more of this inward tangled mess. So what you really want to do is cut most of your roses back to about 20 to 30 centimeters. Find an outward facing bud, and then you want to go around and create this circle where you could put your hand in the middle so there's air, but you want to create this circle where you're imagining a circle where you're always cutting each cane, about 3 to 5 of them ideally, back to an outward facing bud, so you get this nice circular bush forming. So imagine when you're cutting, imagine each cane has to form a circle. You can draw a line between each cane so there's a circle, and then imagine you cutting down to an outward facing bud. So your bush is doing this instead of this. So it's very important. Don't make the mistake of cutting your roses the wrong way if you're going for the aesthetic and healthy look of the plants you see online and a lot of other places. Now there's also the 3Ds of pruning: dead, diseased, and damaged. All these should ideally go when you're pruning back the plant. And when you're pruning, you often want to. It is often a bit of something you have to do intuitively. If you prune too late, your plant has used a lot of energy, sending it into the shoot and starting these new branches. If you prune too early, you can also leave the plant more weak for winter frost. So what I often do is I will often prune my roses as late towards often end March, early April. But the only exception is if I can see they're already doing these really long shoots. Then I want to prune much sooner than that, ideally already when they're like that, because you don't want the plant wasting its energy, putting it all into shoots. You're just going to cut off later, stressing the plant more. So next up, we're going to our next slide here. And our next slide is another beginner mistake I see all the time, constantly. It is when people want a lot of different roses, and I totally get that. I have a special trial bed just for that. It's okay to have a messy sandbox where you can try out new plants. But what I really want to stress is if you want things to look natural, you have to remember that nature always plants things in groups. It's 3, 5, 7, 9. So nature often plants things in groups, and often uneven groups. So if you want your garden to look natural, you want it to look calm, you have to obey by the same principle. You have to plant in groups. And you also often want to repeat things, repeat the same color, repeat the same texture to make things look calm. Now, if you want to do the opposite, you can also add these, I call them often these little pedestal plants, where you do the exact opposite for a focal point. But in general, you want to plant in groups. And another thing you can often do, I also see beginners make the mistake of, is I often see beginners not use perennials nearly enough. A lot of roses get quite tall, and if you plant a really tall rose in the foreground of your flower bed, you'll get these really ugly looking stems, these gangly looking stems you're going to be staring straight into. But you can use perennials, as I'm also showing on this picture over here, the picture with the, to cover up these gangly stems. So if you place a group of perennials in front of your plant, the perennials will do two things for you. It will help cover up where the rose is ugly, but it will also help you provide flowering on a different blooming time or blooming season than the rose plant. So what you're really getting is the best of both worlds. You're prolonging the blooming season by introducing perennials, but you're also covering up some of the rose's weaknesses. And I also noticed in some old rose books, they claim that something like salvia and lavender and a lot of these more herby plants also scare away certain insects. So that might also be worth considering. That having all these perennials also helps both get beneficial insects because they can hide in all this, but also scare away some of the insects you don't want. But let's continue. Yeah, that's another mistake I often see people making. When the rose is shooting these really young, fresh, greenish shoots, they'll often put a lot of compost on the rose. But the thing to remember is compost is something that's degrading. That means organisms are busy breaking it down. So when you put this compost next to something living, something organical, like a rose, the organisms in the soil degrading the compost doesn't actually differentiate between the cells in the rose and the cells in the compost. So what really ends up happening sometimes is the compost gets really warm. You have these microorganisms, and these microorganisms can also damage your young rose shoots when they're first entering out from the bottom. So be very careful putting on compost and creating conditions where things can rot under the compost, because this might damage your new rose shoots. And it also develops a lot of heat, but that's something else. Another thing to remember is you want the compost in the soil often. You want it where the microorganisms can feed on it, but you don't necessarily want it all the way around the root ball of the rose, because, as I said before, compost is not naturally what plants grow in. Plants grow in sand, they grow in silicates, they grow in gravel, they grow in a lot of these stony, more mineral things. They don't necessarily want to grow in peat. What happens to peat is peat breaks down really quickly. If you have a pot rose, what often happens is within 6 months the peat will have compacted so much that it's nearly uninhabitable for the rose. So you actually have to change rose soil if you're using peat in pots every 6 months. Now, what is the good thing about peat? The good thing is it's very nutritious. What is the bad thing? The bad thing is, like I said before, there's a lot of microactivity, and it can also hurt your rose. But another thing to consider is it's also sucking air out of the soil, because you have this breakdown process. And I think the conclusion I've come to personally is it's very good for your roses to have something that's biodegradable, has a lot of nutrients in the first 5 to 10 centimeters of the topsoil, because your plants will get all the nutrients from that and it will break down slowly. Whereas the rest of the flower I often let stay in something like more mineral soil, more natural soil, because the natural soil doesn't compact, and it also has another advantage, and that is that something like the more natural soil also lets a lot of air through, and air is something your rose really needs to help form roots and absorb water. So consider all these factors when you're starting young rose plants, because you want to create an environment, an ecosystem, and you ideally want everything to be balanced. It's not like you can just do one thing and the rose will be fine. You really have to consider the environment the rose is in, its needs, if it's in growth, what time of season it is. So what you're really looking to create is a microbiome. So it's not as simple as just place things in peat and forget. But yeah, peat is not the worst thing you can place it in as long as you know the caveats of peat, because the reason a lot of places started using peat was because it was much more easy to carry pots that are in peat instead of sand and other forms of soil that's really heavy. So it's much easier for nurseries to grow in peat, and these things like sawdust and a lot of other things they are usually growing in. But it's not necessarily the best thing if you want to create a permanent pot where rose is in for a lot of the year. So we'll go over here to the one with water. The reason I say you also have to be careful of too much watering is, as you have to remember before, if a rose has to absorb water, it often also has to have access to oxygen, and those two needs to be in balance. So if you have really waterlogged soil, what often ends up happening is your roses will simply drown because they can't get oxygen. So a lot of people will say roses are really water-loving plants. That's really true. But if you have really dense soil with a lot of clay and you don't make it so there's a lot of air circulation in the soil, you'll also have a very serious problem, because air and water, those two have to be in balance. Your rose needs to exchange one for the other, and it is really another way you have to really be careful not to create this waterlogged soil. You also want to be careful not to create a soil that's too well draining, but you want a soil where air can flow through and that holds moisture. So ideally, like I said before, you want maybe a little bit of peat and maybe a little bit of clay, maybe a little bit of sand. You want to create a well-rounded soil, and you want a lot of organic matter on the top that triggers nutrients down into the plant. But let's continue here to the next slide. Yeah, the next slide is very obvious, but maybe you don't know, but roses, of course, need to be deadheaded. And the reason for that is if you don't deadhead a rose, it starts sending hormones back. And the hormones tells the plant to stop flowering, because now we need to produce seeds. We need to produce hips that produce seeds. So if you don't remove the heads on the roses, deadhead them, you get these hormones going back, telling the plant essentially to focus on something else than blooming. So it's very important you remove the old flower heads when they're spent, simply to prevent these flower heads to send back the hormone that tells the plant to stop blooming. You get much more blooms if you do this. Another thing, as you can clearly see up on the other photos over here, is you have to remove leaves that suffer from blackspot. And sometimes also a few other diseases. Often something like powdery mildew you spray for, but blackspot is something where you really want to remove the whole leaf and maybe also burn it if you have the opportunity. The thing with blackspot is a fungi, and it's always in the air, so you can't avoid it. But when your leaves get infected by it, it's a good idea to remove that leaf to prevent the fungi from spreading to other leaves close to it through contact. So remember to remove the old flower heads, and remember to remove the blackspot leaves. So we'll continue here. Yeah, there's a lot of doubt of how to plant roses, and I've heard so many theories. Some say you should place the grafting point nearly at soil level, others that you should, in cold climates, take it all the way down to 10, 15 centimeters underground. What I tend to prefer is, to have the grafting point 5 to 7 centimeters underground. Often now I do 7 centimeters, but what I will do is I'll put a little bit of soil on top of the crown. The crown is where the rose stems come out from. And I'll put a little bit of soil on top of the crown to protect it from the winter frost, because as long as the crown survives, your rose is okay, even if the stems die out, because they can grow back. So I put a little bit of soil on top of the crown, not much, 2 to 3 centimeters, just to give it a little bit of insulation against the winter. And the reason I don't always plant it at some do like 10 or 15 centimeters under the grafting point is actually because I sometimes found that some roses can rot if I plant them too deep. They never get up out of the soil. So that's why I tend to prefer a planting depth of about 7 centimeters. I would say 5 can sometimes be too little, and 7 to 8 is probably the ideal placement for me. You also want the rose to be deep enough in the soil for it to not be knocked about by the wind and to really anchor itself. So that's why it's also beneficial. So I'm really trying to achieve a balance here, because if you plant it too high, you get problem with these wild shoots. You also get problems with it dying back in winter. If you plant it too deep, you can get problems with rot. So it's really a balance here, but the balance for me is, like I said, these around 7 centimeters and a couple of centimeters soil on top. So, but find your own balance. It might be different from your climate. Like I'm in Scandinavia, so my climate is obviously a bit on the colder side. But in general, I think this is very balanced advice for most places. So let's continue. Yeah, another thing people don't think about when they think about roses is roses actually needs a lot of sun to reliably bloom. There are some exceptions. There are certain roses that prefer, well, I wouldn't say prefer, but they can tolerate a bit of shade. It's often like the musk roses and these more shadow loving roses. But I would say it like this: most roses need about 7 hours of sun to reliably bloom. Some roses prefer all the way up to 16 hours of sun if they can get away with it. But you really need to think about roses as some plants that prefer about 7 hours of sun. So you have to be sure they get at least 7 hours of sunlight per day if you want the reliable blooms. But as I said before, there are some varieties that can go a bit lower, but in my opinion, always provide a rose with at least 7 hours of sun. Many of them prefer much more, as I said, sometimes all the way up to 16 hours. So don't worry about the exact number, as long as somewhere between 7 and yeah, the high end of 16, I would say. So to get more blooms. And also the thing to remember is plants need sun to develop energy. So that's simply how it goes. Photosynthesis. But let's continue here to our last mistake. The last mistake I see people do all the time is growing climbing roses vertically. The thing that happens when you grow a climbing rose vertically is it sends all its energy, all its hormones to the top end of the stem. So you get this really long stem that just goes up, and you get some blooms at the end of that stem. And of course, this doesn't look as pretty, not as full leafed out, not as bushy, not as many blooms. So what you really want to do is you want to more fan out your climbing roses. So for example, if I have 3 stems, I might choose one stem that will go very horizontally this way. And then I'll choose another stem going very horizontally this way. And then I'll choose a middle stem going more vertically before branching it out again to one of the sides. And don't worry you're running out of stems, because what happens when you bend a rose cane is it will naturally, along the whole length of the stem where there's buds, it will naturally start developing new shoots for you. And that is why bending the stem is so efficient with climbing roses, because when you bend the stem, the growth hormone goes to the whole length of the stem, all the side buds get activated, and you get so many blooms. It's insane. Sometimes you can get 9 times more blooms and a much fuller looking rose plant from just doing this. And you can actually also do this with Some of the other normal roses, if you have some of the old historic roses, you can do something called rose pegging. And rose pegging is where you take your long canes and you bend them down towards the ground. And you do that in a circle until you have a bush of these rose canes bent down. And what that will also do is, like I said before, you'll get nearly 9 times as many blooms because the hormones of the plant is telling the plant to shoot along the whole of the stem, and that will create much more blooms for you. So remember, when it comes to climbing roses, always grow them horizontally. You get a much prettier plant out of it, much more blooms, and it just looks fuller. You'll be much more happy with the result. And another mistake I see people do all the time with climbing roses is they cut them all the way back to the ground like it was a tea hybrid. Remember, climbing roses, you want to keep most of the old canes. Sometimes you can do some to renew it. You can remove some of the canes, but you shouldn't remove all canes at once like you do with the tea hybrids. It's very okay with a tea hybrid to cut it down to like 20 centimeters. And some tea hybrids, of course, you want a bit more length on with it depends on the variety, but in general, just remember that. And there's also a slide I haven't I didn't include in this video, and this is more about old historic roses. If you grow old historic roses, it is important you never cut back more than a little bit of the top end of it, because if you cut more back than by 1/3 or something like that, what will often happen is you won't really get blooms the next season. So remember, a lot of old historic roses grow on old wood, old stems. There are some exceptions, like the perpetuals, the remontant, the bourbons. A lot of exceptions to this rule because you have some reflowering old historic roses. So when you're dealing with old historic roses, it really requires much more of you in cutting techniques. But for most of you, the most normal roses you buy are tea hybrids. So a tea hybrid, cut it back to 20-30 centimeters, find that outward facing bud. Keep about 3 to 5 stems that are about a pencil thick. You're golden. And remember, like you often want air circulation in the middle of the plant to avoid powdery mildew and stuff like that. So yeah, that was pretty much the tips I have for you today. As I said before, think about roses as being a part of an ecosystem, and perennials being part of that ecosystem, and many other things. Because if you're thinking parts of ecosystems, you're really thinking of the whole. And another thing I would say is about when you're doing using artificial fertilizer like NPK, you often want to use more nitrogen when the roses start growing, because after winter they need a lot of nitrogen to start producing the long stems and the long and all the leaves. But when you get more towards the middle of the season and the end of the season, they actually prefer more P and K, phosphor, for example, for blooms. So when you're using artificial fertilizer, consider that at the start of the season you need more of the nitrogen, the N, and at the end of the season you need more of the P and K. So phosphor is what produces blooms, nitrogen is what produces leaves. So remember to vary that. Now another caveat I'll say about using artificial fertilizer, these NPK fertilizers, is oftentimes they don't feed the microbiome, and the microbiome matters a lot to roses, because when you really think about it, it is the bacteria in the ground that creates a lot of these micronutrients, be they magnesium, be they a lot of other different things. These bacteria convert a lot of things you give them to other micronutrients that the plants can use. And that is one of the reasons I don't always recommend to just use artificial fertilizer. Artificial fertilizer is much more powerful. That's the advantage of it. It can also be a disadvantage if you don't know what you're doing, because then you can burn your plant. But the shortcoming is you're not really feeding the microbiome, and that's why I also think sometimes you should really use a lot of organic fertilizer, because happy roses often start with a happy soil and a happy microbiome, because that's what feeds the roses all these trace minerals, all these trace micronutrients, and it's also what keeps the the soil airy and nice and fluffy for the plant. So what I'm really trying to teach you here is thinking in terms of environment, thinking in terms of the whole, and if I manage to get you to do that, then this video has been a success. So, but if you like this video, feel free to subscribe. I'll be doing a lot of more content like this, and I'll be doing a lot of garden tours and a lot of other stuff here in the future when my roses are blooming in a month or two. So stay tuned, subscribe if you like more videos and more informative content like this about roses and other plants, and take care out there.